Hello, and welcome to Relax History tonight. We drift into a quieter corner of the war, not the battles, not the guns, but the dirt, the lice, the endless struggle to stay clean. Imagine muddy boots, crusted uniforms, and water so rare it was often saved for tea. Soldiers slept in trenches full of rats, their skin itching beneath wool. No warm baths, no fresh linen. Just the long, slow fight against filth. If you're watching from bed or winding down, what time is it where you are? Let us know in the comments. And if you're enjoying these sleepy stories, tap subscribe and drift with us into the forgotten side of war. You are in a canvas tent, the kind that groans under the weight of frost. It's somewhere in Belgium or eastern France, midwinter, 1917. The kind of cold that tightens your skin and dulls your fingers before you even move. The small coal stove in the corner glows faintly, but it isn't enough. You keep your uniform on, your boots laced, and your hands wrapped in socks that haven't been changed in days. Staying clean is nearly impossible. Water, if available at all, is frozen. What little is kept warm in buckets quickly turns to slush. Soap, issued in limited military rations, is rock hard. Washing your hands in icy water just means numbing them further. For many soldiers, the question becomes, do I wash or do I keep the feeling in my fingers? Officers and medics encouraged hygiene, of course. A clean body was a healthy one, in theory. But there was no warmth, no time, and no privacy. The act of cleaning oneself, already difficult in the trenches, became nearly unthinkable during the winter months. Tin basins turned into ice bowls. Latrines were frozen over. Some soldiers attempted a quick wipe down using a damp rag, but even that rag would stiffen if not dried immediately. There were no towels, no warm rooms, and certainly no baths. Laundry, a rare and clumsy process. If the unit wasn't on the move, a small detail might be assigned to melt snow, boil water, and scrub uniforms with brushes until their hands cracked. Shirts and socks were hung up to dry, but froze solid within the hour, becoming stiff shapes fluttering in the winter wind. Often, uniforms were simply aired out rather than washed, the cold supposedly killing whatever lingered inside the fabric. And then there were the hands, always exposed, always raw. Men used whatever they could to protect them: grease, cloth, candle wax, even old bacon fat. Cracks formed in the skin, small at first, then deeper. A tiny wound could fester into something far worse when hygiene was impossible. Some soldiers would sleep with their hands tucked beneath their arms, desperately trying to keep them warm enough to function in the morning. Still, the worst part wasn't always physical. The constant grime, the rank smell, and the sight of blackened fingernails, it wore down the mind. A soldier might endure gunfire with bravery, but many wrote in their letters about the unending misery of simply being unclean. The dirt seeped into everything. But what happened when this filth turned dangerous? When being unwashed didn't just lower morale but cost lives? Imagine being handed a metal bucket of warm water in the middle of a winter battlefield. Not for drinking, no. This was for washing. It was a luxury, a steaming, fleeting gift that would cool within minutes. Soldiers huddled around it, dipping rags and cloths, splashing their faces, rubbing cracked skin raw, just for a sense of normalcy. The bucket would make its rounds quickly, the water turning gray, then brown, and finally cold again. And then it was gone. This ritual was rare, often happening only when a camp was semi-stationary. For troops in active combat zones, even this moment of hygiene was a fantasy. In some sectors, they melted snow just to rinse a handkerchief. Others used the water from their soup pot after meals, even if it was greasy and filled with crumbs. Anything was better than nothing. Feet, however, were a far more serious concern. Trench foot was one of the war's silent threats, caused not just by water, but by cold, dirty, constricted skin. Boots were often wet and rarely removed. Socks were seldom changed, and many were woolen blends that stiffened when damp. The army knew this, and so began issuing orders: rotate socks, dry your feet, rub them with whale oil. But how do you follow orders when your boots are frozen to your ankles? Frostbite was another danger. It didn't just cause panic, it caused amputations. Some soldiers tried to wrap newspaper around their toes for extra insulation. Others stuffed straw into their boots. One memoir described a man who wore the same pair of socks for 19 days straight, sleeping in them, marching in them, and pulling them off only when the skin beneath had begun to slough off. But what choice did he have? Bath parades, when they occurred, were more ordeal than relief. Soldiers marched through the cold to temporary bath stations, sometimes just a row of barrels heated over fires. Undress, dip, scrub, fast, get out. There was no comfort in it. The air stung, the water scalded, and the return march meant your freshly cleaned body froze all over again. Even then, you'd put your same dirty uniform back on, because there were no spare sets. A clean soldier was simply one who had managed to wash the top layer of grime, yet somehow they endured. They learned to joke about the stink, to swap strategies, to treasure a dry sock as much as a warm meal. It wasn't about feeling fresh, it was about keeping the body alive and functioning one more day. But as the war dragged on, what role did hygiene play in shaping the strategies, routines, and morale of the larger army? You lower yourself into a narrow, muddy trench. The walls are slick, reinforced with sandbags that have begun to rot. It's spring, but the rain hasn't stopped in days, and the mud clings like glue. Your boots sink with each step, and you know that beneath the surface lies a mix of soil, human waste, and sometimes worse. This is where you'll eat, sleep, fight and attempt to stay clean. The trenches were not temporary shelters. They were long-term homes for entire battalions. Carved into the landscape of the Western Front, they twisted like veins across the countryside. And inside them, soldiers lived in filth. Hygiene, as a military priority, was present in theory, but absent in practice. There were sanitation manuals, yes, but applying them required water, soap, time, and space, none of which were plentiful. Mud was the most obvious enemy. It was everywhere, not just on your boots or coat, but layered into your skin, behind your ears, under your nails. Soldiers wrote home describing how they'd wake up with mud on their lips or in their teeth. It got into everything: rifles, rations, blankets. And the more you moved, the more it followed. But the real terror came in smaller forms. Lice were unavoidable. They bred in the seams of uniforms and laid eggs in folds of fabric. No matter how often soldiers picked them off or burned their clothes, with candles, the lice returned, and they didn't just itch. They brought trench fever, painful, recurring illness that could sideline men for weeks. It was common for soldiers to scratch themselves bloody in their sleep. Washing was a rare and improvised act. A soldier might rinse his hands in a puddle or wipe his face with a rag dampened from a rain barrel. There were no proper sinks, no running water. You could boil water over a tiny flame if you had fuel, but the effort often wasn't worth it. Underwear and socks were rarely changed. Sometimes, men traded clothes just for variety, though all were equally infested when proper. Laundry facilities were available. They were usually far behind the lines. Clothes would be carted off to mobile disinfection units, steam-powered machines or boiling vats meant to kill lice and bacteria. But by the time your uniform returned, it was often stiff, shrunk, and missing a button or two. Some soldiers preferred to keep their old, dirty uniform because it at least fit. Officers issued inspections. Cleanliness was supposed to be a matter of discipline, but inspecting boots that had been submerged for a week or fingernails stained by blood and oil seemed almost laughable. Still, they tried. Soap was issued in tiny cubes. Foot powder was distributed sporadically. Instructions were read aloud. In the rain, but in the end, how did soldiers adapt mentally and physically to living in such unrelenting filth? You sit on an overturned ammo crate in the trench, shirt half open, a candle in one hand, your eyes scanning each seam. It's time for the daily lice hunt. Every soldier does its cowering the inside of their uniform with a flickering flame, watching for tiny white eggs and crawling specks. The goal isn't to eliminate them. That's impossible. The goal is simply to reduce the population. This private war against lice became a part of daily routine, as normal as checking your rifle or eating rations. Soldiers developed techniques heating the inside of their collars, scraping seams with knives, or holding garments over fires to try and kill the infestation. The clothes would sometimes scorch, but it was considered a worthwhile risk. Lice caused relentless itching, sleepless nights, and trench fever, a disease marked by high fevers, headaches, and leg pain that could last for weeks. The lice weren't alone. Socks, always damp, began to rot on men's feet. Soldiers who couldn't dry their socks properly developed fungal infections, sores, and trench foot. A soldier's foot hygiene became as important as his aim. Orders were issued. Change socks daily. Rub feet with whale oil. Elevate your legs when possible. But changing socks meant having a clean pair, and rubbing in oil meant having access to it. Most DIDN single quotes T. Occasionally, units were rotated out of the front for rest, which often meant time to clean. These breaks were eagerly anticipated, not just for the sleep and safety, but for the bath parades. Soldiers would march, still in full kit, to a nearby village or sanitation station. There, a group of tents or sheds had been set up, hot water in tubs or barrels. If you were lucky, you were handed a cube of army-issued soap, sometimes gritty with sand, and told to clean up. The bath itself was usually short and crowded. Privacy was non-existent. The water cooled quickly, and the line behind you was long. Then came the uniform swap. Your dirty clothes would be taken away, sometimes laundered, sometimes burned, and you'd be handed a different set, rarely new, often just as infested. Still, the psychological boost of even a partial cleaning was remarkable. Men left these parades grinning, if only briefly. The war didn't allow for consistent hygiene. The mud always returned. The lice reappeared, but soldiers kept trying. They boiled water in helmets. They dried socks over fires. They shaved with cold razors and wiped their faces with wet cloths, not because it made them clean, but because it reminded them they were still human. Yet, one wonders, in a war where the filth was constant, did those fleeting moments of cleanliness offer real hope, or just a temporary illusion of order? It's early morning, and the sun hasn't yet warmed the damp air hanging over the trenches. Somewhere between the first mug of tea and the second cigarette, it hits the need to relieve yourself. But there are no proper bathrooms here. Just a narrow plank suspended over a pit, or if you're unlucky, a bucket behind a torn canvas sheet. Welcome to the overlooked front of World War hygiene, waste disposal. Latrines, or the necessary, were essential to survival, not because they offered comfort, but because their absence brought disease. At the start of the war, many camps simply didn't have them. Men relieved themselves wherever they could, behind sandbags, in shell holes, or over the edge of the trench. The results were predictable. Flies multiplied, and with them came outbreaks of dysentery and cholera. As the war ground on, armies recognized the critical need for organized waste management. Field sanitation manuals were produced. Latrines were ordered to be dug at least 30 yards from any cooking area, covered daily with soil, and relocated regularly. There were different types: slit, trenches, bucket latrines, and incinerator-style troughs that used fuel to burn waste. Some were just deep holes with a wooden seat placed across the top. Others were little more than glorified pits with no cover. Latrine duty became one of the most dreaded assignments in the army. Young recruits were often sent out at night with shovels to dig new pits. Others were tasked with carrying full waste buckets to designated disposal areas, often through mud, under shell fire, or in the middle of freezing rain. It was physically draining and socially humiliating, yet utterly necessary. A single neglected latrine could contaminate a whole water source. The problem of privacy made things worse. There was rarely a door. Canvas sheets flapped in the wind. Men sat shoulder to shoulder on long communal benches. Some soldiers refused to go during daylight at all, choosing instead to wait until darkness provided some cover. This led to delays, accidents, and in many cases, men simply holding it far too long, causing health issues of their own. And yet, even in this filth, discipline was expected. Officers inspected latrine areas for cleanliness. Lime was sprinkled in pits to reduce smell and kill bacteria. Posters were printed, urging soldiers to do their bit for cleanliness, even when it meant hauling a bucket of human waste under enemy fire. Still, the question lingers: in a world where comfort was gone and dignity worn thin, how did men find the strength to maintain even the most basic standards of sanitation? Midday in the trenches was often the worst time for sanitation. The sun, when it shone, didn't bring warmth, it brought flies, thousands of them. They clustered around the latrines, swarmed the mess areas, and crawled over food, faces, and open wounds. The presence of flies wasn't just disgusting, it was deadly. Each one was a vector, carrying filth from the latrines to the lips of men who hadn't washed in days. Dysentery swept through camps like wildfire. Soldiers would be fine one morning, and by evening they were too weak to stand. The condition was relentless: diarrhea, dehydration, and fever that left a man unable to fight, march, or even sit upright. Makeshift infirmaries were quickly overwhelmed. In some units, it became more common to lose men to dysentery than to enemy fire. The army responded with increasingly rigid rules. Latrines had to be dug and maintained daily. Buckets filled with quicklime were placed near them to help neutralize the stench and bacteria. Officers conducted sanitation rounds alongside weapon checks, but no amount of order could change the fact that latrines had to be emptied, and that job fell to the infamous bucket brigade. The bucket brigade was a rotating duty assigned to lower-ranking soldiers. The task was simple in description, but miserable. In execution, carry full latrine buckets, sometimes sloshing, always heavy, out of the trench system to designated dumping grounds or incineration pits. The journey was long, the contents foul, and the work deeply resented. Many men did it gagging, with scarves over their mouths, or tobacco rubbed under their noses to mask the stench. In colder months, the contents froze and could be shoveled. In summer, they sloshed and spilled, attracting insects and turning every pathway into a hazard. Buckets would sometimes tip mid-journey, soaking uniforms and boots, making the rest of a shift unbearable. And yet the work continued. Someone had to do it. To improve morale or, perhaps just make the task more tolerable, some soldiers gave the latrines nicknames: the Glory Hole, Churchill's Throne, or the Officers' Club. Humor became a defense, a way to make waste feel less humiliating. Still, men who returned from latrine duty often stood silently at the edge of the trench, waiting for the smell to fade before rejoining the group. Even amid the chaos of war, armies understood. Waste management meant survival. Hygiene wasn't optional, it was strategic. An army too sick to move was an army ready to lose. But how did the constant contact with human waste reshape a soldier's view of dignity, discipline, and what it truly meant to endure? You lift your canteen and give it a shake. A hollow rattle nearly empty. Water, the most basic human need, is in short supply. Not because of desert terrain or distant rivers, but because war has made everything dirty. The streams are filled with corpses, the wells poisoned, and the rainfall channeled into the mud at your feet. And still, you must drink. Clean drinking water was one of the great, underappreciated challenges of both world wars. Troops needed it not only to survive, but to cook, wash, and maintain equipment. Yet the front lines offered few reliable sources. Often, soldiers were forced to collect water from shell holes, craters left behind by explosions that filled with rain. These puddles were murky, filled with debris, bacteria, and sometimes decomposing bodies. Still, they were used. Boiling was the first line of defense. When time and fuel allowed, soldiers heated water in metal mess tins or communal buckets. The process was slow, and fuel wasn't always available. Wood was wet. Coal was reserved for more critical tasks. So water was sometimes consumed as this, cloudy, gritty, and foul-smelling. To cope, militaries issued purification tablets, often iodine-based, that made water safer to drink, but left it tasting bitter and metallic. Some soldiers preferred the risk of disease over the taste. Others tried to mask it with tea leaves or coffee if they had any. Tea became more than a comfort, it was a survival tool, helping to disguise the flavor of water drawn from questionable sources. Engineers and medical officers worked hard to bring clean water forward to the front lines. Large metal tanks were hauled by horses or trucks, filled from tested wells behind the lines, and distributed in canvas carriers. But even then, the risk of contamination remained. A single dirty ladle or canteen cap could introduce germs into an entire batch. In busy trenches, hygiene slipped fast. Improvised filters made from cloth or sand were common. Some men strained their water through socks or handkerchiefs. Others let it settle overnight, watching the sediment sink before carefully pouring off the top. There was no guarantee it worked, but it felt better than nothing. Water discipline became a constant part of military life. Canteens were rationed. Soldiers were taught to sip sparingly, to share only when necessary, and to refill at every opportunity, no matter how foul the source. The act of drinking became strategic, and the risk of not drinking even greater. But what happened when an entire company fell ill, not from wounds, but from the very water they needed to stay alive? The worst part wasn't the thirst. It was the nausea, the fever, and the aching joints that came after. In both World War I and World War II, waterborne illness was among the greatest invisible threats to any fighting force. And no matter how much effort went into purification, sickness still crept in. Dysentery, Typhoid fever and cholera were the most common culprits. All could be traced to contaminated water, and all could take down a soldier faster than a bullet. In some units, these illnesses spread like wildfire. One careless refill, one shared mug, one rushed moment without boiling, then a dozen men doubled over in pain within days, despite their best efforts. Troops often lacked the tools for proper sanitation. Boiling water took time. Disinfecting tablets ran out, and in the chaos of battle, careful hygiene slipped down the list of priorities. Soldiers reusing their gear, eating with unwashed hands, or sharing utensils could quickly undo all efforts at cleanliness. Water was scarce, and using it to wash was considered wasteful, even foolish. Field medics and doctors saw the patterns again and again. A platoon would come in strong, well-fed, well-trained, then slowly begin to weaken, not from enemy fire, but from stomach cramps and dehydration. They treated it with rest and fluids when those were available. More often, they offered chalky powders, bitter tonics, or just hope. A man too sick to fight was sometimes left behind in makeshift infirmaries, wrapped in a wool blanket, sweating out his infection in a barn or dugout far from the front. Efforts were made to fix the problem. Portable water purification units were developed, using carbon filters and chemicals. These were large, heavy machines, reliable but hard to move. Some soldiers swore by them. Others never saw one. A single purification truck could only serve so many men. Meanwhile, military engineers dug boreholes and constructed makeshift reservoirs wherever they could, trying to create cleaner access points. But even these could be sabotaged by a sudden shell or contaminated by runoff. The war moved too fast for sanitation to keep up. Even off the battlefield, the water issue lingered. In occupied towns and cities, local wells and pipes were often damaged or neglected. Troops resorted to local sources, rivers, fountains, even rain barrels. Risk was everywhere, and for every bucket of safe water, another was drawn from a source no one could truly trust. And yet, despite all of this, armies endured. Not because the water became cleaner, but because habits formed, boiling when possible, filtering when necessary, and drinking with caution. Survival meant knowing what to fear in war. The enemy wasn't always holding a gun, but what happened to the villages and civilians? Caught in the middle, those who had no purification tablets, no boiling stoves, and no choice but to drink from the same streams soldiers filled with waste. You probably imagine war as loud, smoky, and brutal, and it was. But deep in the muddy trenches, there was another quiet enemy, persistent, tiny, and always itching. Lice were more than just a nuisance during the world wars. They were a fact of life. For many soldiers, the itch began within days of settling into a trench. These lice, body lice to be exact, thrived in the folds of unwashed clothing, particularly in the seams of woolen uniforms. They laid their eggs there, warmed by body heat, undisturbed by baths that never came. It didn't take long for a soldier to become infested. The crawling sensation, especially around the waist, armpits, and neck, became a constant distraction. The bites caused red welts and skin irritation. Scratching led to open sores, and open sores, in the filthy environment of the trenches, could easily become infected. But lice weren't just irritating, they were dangerous. Many carried Rickettsia prausicii, the bacteria that caused trench fever. This illness brought sudden fevers, intense headaches, leg pain, and weeks of weakness. It didn't kill, but it often removed men from the line for extended periods. Some battalions, lost more soldiers to lice-borne illness than to enemy fire. Efforts to control lice were continuous but often futile. Soldiers tried bathing when they could, but hot water was rare. They burned their uniforms with candles to kill the eggs in the seams, risking holes and burns. Others dusted themselves with powders like naphthalene or creosote, which smelled terrible and irritated the skin, but offered some relief. Delousing stations were eventually set up behind the lines. Here, men stripped down and handed over their clothing to be boiled or steamed. In return, they sometimes received clean underclothes or their own clothes, at least temporarily rid of pests. The process was humiliating and uncomfortable, but welcomed by most. Unfortunately, reinfestation often began within hours of returning to the trenches. The psychological toll of lice shouldn't be underestimated. Soldiers described lying awake at night, unable to stop scratching. They dreamed of insects. They joked about it to cope, giving the lice names or pretending they were pets. But underneath the humor was a deep, constant discomfort, one that wore down morale as surely as shellfire. Lice didn't discriminate. They thrived in the beards of generals and the boots of privates. Wherever men slept in their clothes, sweated through their uniforms, or huddled together for warmth, lice followed. Yet somehow, men kept going, scratching, cursing, and enduring. They learned to ignore the constant movement under their shirts, just as they ignored the rumble of distant artillery. The war wasn't just about battles, it was about surviving the daily, itchy grind. And still, one question crawls beneath the surface. If lice were everywhere, why did it take so long for armies to find a permanent solution? If lice made the trenches miserable, fleas and rats turned that misery into a daily infestation. The war wasn't just against the enemy, it was against the biting, scurrying, creeping life that made the trenches a breeding ground of discomfort and disease. Fleas were less talked about than lice, but they were no less present. These tiny jumpers, often carried by the rats that ran unchecked through the trenches, found their way into every layer of the soldier's existence. They infested bedding rolls, burrowed into shared straw mattresses, and made their homes in the damp wood of dugouts. Unlike lice, which clung to clothing, fleas were stealthier, often biting the ankles and legs before vanishing into the folds of a uniform or blanket. Their bites were painful and caused welts that took days to subside. More troubling, however, was their role in spreading diseases. While not as common as trench fever, flea-borne infections occasionally made their rounds, especially in warmer months or crowded rear camps. Men would return from brief rest periods, scratching and swollen, bringing more pests back with them to the front lines. Then came the rats, bold, fat, and utterly unbothered by the presence of humans. These weren't shy creatures. They ran across sleeping bodies, nested under duckboards, and gorged themselves on food scraps and, far more disturbingly, the unburied dead. Soldiers recounted waking up to rats nibbling their boots or gnawing on exposed toes. The animals grew large, some the size of small cats, and their numbers were impossible to control. Rats and fleas were partners in crime. Fleas hitched rides on rats, spreading easily from one part of a trench system to another. Blankets passed from man to man or left damp and folded in corners became perfect hiding places. Even when men were given new ones, infestations returned within days. It was a cycle too entrenched to break. The army tried to intervene. Units were occasionally given disinfected bedding or fumigated dugouts, and poison bait was scattered in trench corners. But nature always seemed one step ahead. By the time a rat population was reduced in one area, it exploded in another. Fleas and lice could lay dormant, hidden in a forgotten blanket or an unwashed coat. Despite it all, men adapted. They shook out their bedding religiously. They slapped at their ankles in the middle of conversation. They joked about trench roommates and learned to sleep through the scratching, the squeaking, and even the sensation of something crawling across their skin. But what might surprise you most is this: despite thousands of cases of trench fever, despite years of rats and insects, armies never fully solved the pest problem. Even now, one wonders, was the biggest battle of World War. Hygiene never really won at all. You might not expect it, but soldiers in the First World War were still expected to shave daily. Orders were orders, after all. Even in the coldest, wettest trenches, men were told to present themselves with a clean face. The logic, in part, came from gas masks. A tight seal was harder to achieve over a scruffy beard. But it also came from military tradition, discipline, order, and hygiene, in theory. And so, with numb fingers and dull blades, soldiers dragged razors across their faces each morning, often using ice-cold water drawn from muddy puddles or ration tins. There were no mirrors. Helmets and canteen bottoms became substitutes. Without lather or warm water, the result was often a bloody meskets, scrapes, and raw skin that stung under the grit of trench life. Soap was rationed, too, though it was rarely used for just one purpose. If you had a bar, you might use it on your clothes, your body, your mess tin, and begrudgingly your face. Soldiers traded for soap like it was currency. A fresh bar, unscented and wrapped in paper, was a small miracle. But even with soap, cleanliness was more theory than practice. Mud got into everything. It caked boots and clothing. It clogged razors and coated combs. Rain turned trenches into swamps, and grooming routines became a daily dance with the impossible. Beards were often trimmed with pocket knives, and some soldiers abandoned shaving altogether when no officer was watching. Those caught unshaven, however, might be punished extra duties, drills, or worse. The British Army's 1914 handbook laid out grooming expectations in detail. It recommended dry shaving when water was unavailable. American troops were issued safety razors, but blades wore down quickly. Hygiene was communal, too. In dugouts or wash stations, men lined up to share buckets of water. The routine was repetitive, but it was grounding, one of the few constants in a world of chaos. Wounds from shaving could be more serious than they looked. Infection was a constant threat. One cut from a rusty razor, mixed with trench mud, or a splash of contaminated water, could swell into something far worse. There were no antiseptics readily available, just salt, spit, and the hope of a clean bandage. Still, many soldiers clung to the ritual. Even if the war made them filthy, bloody, and bone-tired, shaving was a small act of defiance. A way to say, I'm still human, I'm still me. But how long can a man keep up appearances when the world around him is crumbling, and the tools of dignity are rusting in his pocket? As the war dragged on, the daily shave stopped feeling like an act of discipline and began to feel like a slow punishment. With each stroke of the blade came not just pain, but risk. Skin already chafed from weeks of lice, dirty uniforms, and endless sweating became raw and inflamed. Men itched constantly under their collars, behind their knees, between their fingers. Itching led to scratching. Sores invited infection. Hygiene facilities were primitive at best, and non-existent at worst. A soldier might be lucky to find a small wash basin filled once a day. Shared towels were the norm, often sour-smelling and stiff with old soap and dried mud, Towels were rarely washed. They simply rotated from one man to the next until they disintegrated or were burned. Dermatitis, boils, ringworm, and fungal infections spread easily. The close quarters, shared equipment, and damp conditions turned the smallest irritations into medical issues. Military doctors recorded cases of razor rash that developed into weeping lesions. Soldiers sometimes used oil or lard, whatever they could get to soften the blade's pull or soothe their ruined skin. Shaving wasn't the only trigger for skin trouble. The chemicals in cheap wartime soap, often mixed with harsh antiseptics or ground pumice, stripped skin bare. Some soldiers stopped using soap entirely, choosing the filth they knew over the raw skin that followed a full-body scrub. The skin, ironically, became their last defense. Hardened by grime, it was less likely to break or blister. But skin diseases weren't just discomforts. They could get a man pulled from the front. Infected wounds needed cleaning and dressing. In more serious cases, a soldier might be sent back to a field hospital where the cure was nearly as uncomfortable as the disease as cold compresses, acidic ointments, and tightly wound gauze that stuck to raw skin. Some soldiers tried home remedies from their pre-war lives coal dust. Vinegar, even urine, were used to cleanse the skin or soothe a rash. These improvisations varied wildly in their success, but when resources were scarce, anything seemed worth a try. What mattered most was managing discomfort long enough to survive another day. Another inspection, another charge over the top. In the end, personal grooming was less about health and more about habit. For many, it became an act of stubbornness. The war might control their schedules, their meals, and their bodies, but not their faces. Not entirely. Still, one couldn't help but wonder, when every touch of the razor meant the risk of rot and infection, was cleanliness really worth the cost? You've likely never thought about the humble act of relieving yourself as anything more than routine. But during World War I, in the muddy, rat-infested trenches of Europe, going to the latrine was a small saga in itself, an experience filled with rules, rot, and the daily dance between biology and survival. Most trench systems had what were called latrine trenches, rudimentary pits dug at the edge or just outside of the living trenches. These were nothing more than shallow holes, often only a few feet deep and sometimes lined with wooden planks to prevent slipping. Soldiers used them quickly, especially under threat of sniper fire or shelling. Privacy was a luxury, time was limited, and dignity was optional. When the latrines filled, they were covered with a thin layer of soil and another trench was dug. But in areas of heavy fighting or static positioning, the same pits were reused long after they should have been abandoned. In dry spells, the stench lingered. In wet weather, it flooded back into the trenches. Men often tried not to breathe. When passing latrine zones, flies were constant companions. These weren't just annoyances, they were deadly vectors of dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. The flies would land on excrement one moment, then on a soldier's food the next. In the most unsanitary conditions, it became impossible to tell what was contaminating whom. Even basic habits, like washing hands after using the latrine, were difficult to uphold, especially when clean water was rationed for drinking. Some officers tried to enforce hygiene discipline by assigning latrine duty-making. Men take turns digging new pits, liming the waste, and posting guard to ensure soldiers didn't use unofficial spots. But in the chaos of battle, order often gave way to expedience. The nearest dark corner became the toilet. Hygiene plans collapsed under artillery fire. Improvised methods appeared everywhere. Some soldiers relieved themselves in empty food tins or sandbags and hurled them far from the line. Others simply designated foul corners of their trenches as permanent waste zones. And then there were the honey buckets, barrels, or buckets half filled with lime, emptied occasionally if someone remembered. Few volunteered for that duty. Despite the unsavory setup, trench latrines weren't ignored by command. Army medical officers tracked disease rates and pushed for better sanitation. Field manuals were updated. Education campaigns taught soldiers about bacteria, even if many didn't understand it. Still, with mud at your ankles and shells overhead, washing your hands was rarely a top priority. The strange thing is, amid such filth, many soldiers still worried about appearances. They shaved, they brushed their uniforms. They wrote letters home trying to sound clean, composed, and proud. But in truth, they lived with waste in ways no letter ever fully described. And when a latrine overflowed in the rain, seeping into the place you slept, how could you ever feel clean again? You sit in the trench, knee-deep in mud, staring at the line of soldiers shuffling toward the latrine trench with reluctant steps. No one wants to go, but no one can avoid it. And it's not just discomfort they're avoiding, it's danger. A poorly placed latrine wasn't just a nuisance. It could be a death sentence. Trench, foot, lice, and rats may have stolen the spotlight, but dysentery quietly claimed its own grim share of lives, caused by contaminated food and water, often from inadequate sanitation practices. The disease spread rapidly when latrines were positioned too close to the trenches or water sources. During summer months, the rate of infection soared. Entire companies were reduced to half strength, not by bullets, but by diarrhea and vomiting. Sanitation crews, often made up of medical orderlies or lower-ranking troops, were charged with managing this invisible enemy. Their job was to inspect the latrines, lime the pits, and cover waste. Lime was vital. It neutralized odors and slowed bacterial spread. When lime ran out, soldiers sometimes used ash or soil. When that ran out, they simply hoped the wind blew in a forgiving direction. The British Army eventually introduced the Elson tank, a chemical toilet encased in wood or metal. It was a step up from the open trench, but only marginally. These tanks had to be manually emptied, and the soldiers tasked with it were often mocked or avoided, nicknamed sand men or bucket boys. Yet they were unsung heroes, fighting disease with shovels and barrels instead of rifles. Soap was issued, but rarely enough. In water-scarce sectors, men resorted to wiping their hands with sand, leaves, or even their sleeves. Some trench units devised makeshift hand-washing stations using upturned helmets filled with rainwater or reused tea tins strung up on posts. These gestures mattered. In a world where infection lurked on every surface, even a muddy rinse felt like a victory. Still, the burden of cleanliness was never shared equally. Officers often had access to better facilities, cleaner supplies, and dedicated orderlies. Frontline infantry bore the brunt of squalor, and yet, among the worst of conditions, camaraderie often bloomed in odd places, like helping a mate dig a new latrine pit during a lull in artillery, or warning someone not to step in the wrong corner. War memoirs rarely devote chapters to sanitation. The stink, the slime, the daily decades, a forgotten front of its own. But for the soldiers, these moments weren't small. They shaped morale, they shaped survival, and when someone fell ill from something preventable, it reminded everyone how fragile life had become. So the question lingers, in a war known for its trenches, why do we so rarely talk about what was left behind in them? Imagine yourself covered in dried sweat, dust, and grime after days of crawling through trenches, wrapped in a thick wool uniform. There's no breeze, no bathhouse, and certainly no hot water. Yet somehow, you're expected to function, fight, and stay clean. But how did soldiers in World War I and II wash when there was no water to be found? The answer was, they didn't. Not in the traditional sense. Water was for drinking first. Everything else came second. In the best-case scenario, troops had access to a communal water barrel. In the worst, they rationed out a cupful per day, barely enough to sip, let alone scrub. So they found alternatives. Sand and coarse cloth were rubbed on the skin to scrape off grime. Salt, when available, was used like a scrub, rough and painful, but somewhat effective. It stung open cuts and left skin raw, but it gave the illusion of cleanliness. Soap was issued sparingly. The brown military issue soap wasn't fragrant or gentle, it was closer to lie than luxury. Sometimes it doubled as shaving cream and laundry detergent, but to use it, you needed water. So soldiers became resourceful. They caught rain in helmets, reused the same basin water for multiple men, or even rubbed soap directly on skin without rinsing. In colder climates, hygiene became even more difficult. Ice had to be melted for even a splash of water, and washing exposed skin meant risking frostbite. Men wore the same socks and underclothes for weeks, turning them inside out to stretch their use, the smell overpowering. But after a while, noses adjusted, and when everyone stank equally, no one noticed. During rest periods, soldiers might be rotated back to a nearby village or rear camp for bathing. These moments were celebrated like holidays. Mobile delousing units were sometimes available, where men would strip, soak, and hope to emerge feeling human again. The bath might involve lukewarm water and communal basins, but compared to the front, it felt like a luxury spa. Then there were the clever tricks. Soldiers in desert environments used sand not only to clean, but also to dry. In jungle regions, leaves were used as makeshift towels. Those stationed near rivers risked sniper fire just for the chance to jump in and rinse off. Of course, even these moments were fleeting. The next march, the next battle, the next downpour would undo any effort. And so, the idea of hygiene shifted. It was no longer about being clean. It was about being less filthy than the day before. But did these half measures make a difference? Or were they just one more ritual in a war where survival depended more on luck than soap? If cleanliness is next to godliness, then the trenches must have been a kind of hell. The improvised hygiene methods of World War I and II soldiers were not just about comfort, they were a battle against disease. And yet, even as infections spread and lice burrowed into uniforms, soldiers followed routines as best they could. Because, in war, even washing with sand could be an act of discipline. Lice were everywhere. They lived in seams, under collars, and in the folds of woolen underwear. Soldiers called them cooties, and they were almost impossible to get rid of. Without proper baths, delousing became its own grim ritual, burning seams with lighters, shaving heads, and sometimes even placing clothing near fires to roast the lice alive. The smell of scorched fabric and singed insects was common in the back lines. Then came the rashes. Soldiers often developed trench rash, painful raw skin from constant friction, poor hygiene, and wet clothing. Fungus was rampant in jungle campaigns, while frostbite and cracked skin plagued the Eastern Front. The simple act of washing could mean the difference between staying in the ranks or being hospitalized. Officers knew this. Cleanliness routines, no matter how inadequate, were strictly enforced. Some soldiers would be punished for looking too unkempt, even when there was no way to be clean. It wasn't about hygiene, it was about order. A shaved face, a brushed boot, or a wiped rifle were signs that a man hadn't yet surrendered to the filth. And then there was the morale factor. Letters from home often remarked on the smell of returned clothing. Soldiers joked about it, but they also felt shame. In mobile hospitals, nurses sometimes refused to touch patients until they had been scrubbed. Baths became more than a physical necessity. They were a brief return to dignity. Medical units carried powdered disinfectants, rudimentary soaps, and vinegar-based rinses. These did little to kill bacteria, but were used anyway. Uniforms were often rotated, boiled, or beaten with sticks to remove pests. Laundry lines stretched between bombed-out buildings, and spare shirts were traded like currency in the Pacific. Rain offered moments of unexpected cleanliness, but it came with leeches and tropical illnesses. In Europe, washing was sometimes done in ditches or puddles, with men standing in line to splash a handful of muddy water on their faces. For many, the closest thing to a bath was wiping down with a rag soaked in spirits or oil. But through it all, one thing remained constant: the smell of survival. Acrid sweat, oil, mildew, blood, and powder. It clung to uniforms, rifles, tents, and memories. Even decades later, veterans spoke of that smell not with disgust, but with recognition. So, did these makeshift hygiene routines actually work? Or were they just a thin veil of humanity pulled over the chaos of war? In the quiet moments between shelling and marching, soldiers often sat in rows, not with weapons in hand, but with clippers, razors, or sometimes just sharp knives. Haircuts in the field were more than cosmetic. They were acts of necessity, discipline, and at times, survival. In muddy trenches, dense jungles, and icy forests, cutting hair wasn't about looking good. It was about keeping lice at bay and morale intact. Lice thrived in the close quarters of war. Helmets trapped heat, and sweat and infrequent washing turned heads into breeding grounds. Soldiers scratched until their scalps bled. Medical reports from both world wars describe entire units infested, suffering from what they called louse fatigue, a kind of mental and physical exhaustion that came from endless itching and discomfort. And so, shaving the head became routine, a crude form of pest control. But tools were limited. Sometimes a proper razor was passed around the unit. Other times, a soldier would offer up his own belt knife, heated over a flame for sterilization. The process was quick and rough. There were no mirrors. One man cut while the others waited, sitting still as blades scraped over their skin. The cuts didn't always go smoothly. Nicks and scrapes were common. Infection wasn't far behind. Still, the ritual continued. Barber kits were issued in some armies, containing scissors, clippers, combs, and brushes. But in many theaters of war, these were luxury items. Improvised tools became the norm. Scissors were sharpened on stones. Comb teeth were repaired with wire. Even bayonets were sometimes used for a makeshift shave, held steady while a comrade scraped along the edge. And the ritual had rules. In certain regiments, new recruits were shaved entirely bald upon arrival or symbolic shedding of their civilian identity. Others had weekly grooming standards, enforced even under fire. Some officers believed that neatness on the outside helped keep order on the inside. A cleaned-up soldier was a focused soldier. There was also camaraderie in it, men joked. As they cut, teased one another about bald spots, and uneven lines. For a few minutes, it was almost normal, just a haircut among friends. But there was tension too. Some resisted the blade, holding on to their hair as a final symbol of self. In prisoner camps, forced shavings were used to humiliate. For others, it was a gift relief from lice and a return to something resembling care. The irony wasn't lost on those in the field. In the middle of destruction, they carved out time for grooming. Why did it matter so much? Why did they bother when the world was falling apart around them? As the war wore on, the simple act of cutting hair took on meanings far beyond hygiene. Field haircuts became subtle expressions of power, resistance, and routine. The shaved head wasn't just clean, it was regulation. It told you who belonged, who followed orders, and who hadn't yet let the chaos in. In some elite units, uniform hair length was a matter of pride. The French Foreign Legion, for example, kept precise grooming even in the desert. In the U.S. Army, tidy cuts became part of the soldier's silhouette, just as recognizable as the helmet and rifle. A fresh cut meant discipline. Letting it grow wild could earn a reprimand. Even in the muddiest, most remote postings, some commanding officers demanded routine grooming schedules, complete with inspections. The ritual gave structure. For soldiers who had lost count of the days, haircutting became one of the few ways to mark time. Shave and a haircut meant another week survived. Some described the act as strangely meditative, shaving a buddy's head by lantern light in the middle of a darkened tent, with rain hammering on the canvas. A moment of focus, of normalcy. In prisoner of war camps, the loss of that choice became its own statement. Heads were shaved by guards, not for cleanliness, but control. Hair was stripped to erase identity, to humiliate. Yet even then, prisoners found ways to resist. They traded sharpened spoons, hoarded soap, and passed down cutting tips, whispered between bunk beds. Holding on to a sense of self, even in a half-inch of carefully trimmed stubble, became a quiet act of rebellion. There were cultural layers to Sikh soldiers in the British Indian Army faced a profound conflict. Religious customs forbade cutting hair. Some refused, risking punishment. Others cut and quietly mourned. Hair, in these contexts, wasn't just hygiene, it was sacred. And then there were the moments of transformation. Soldiers on leave let their hair grow back, eager to shed the military look, only to cut it again the night before returning. The ritual became personal, a way of moving between worlds. As victory drew near or defeat loomed, the frequency of haircuts often dropped. Some soldiers let their hair grow long in the final weeks, part fatigue, part defiance. In the pictures of soldiers marching home, you can see it, a mix of fresh cuts and shaggy heads, each carrying the story of where they'd been. But the question remains, why did so many cling to this ritual in the very worst conditions imaginable? Why, in the wreckage of war, did so many find comfort in the simple sound of hair being clipped? You can imagine the trenches, mud, damp, rot, but what you might not picture is the constant crawling. Lice were everywhere, in every uniform seam, in every blanket fold, tucked behind ears, scuttling under waistbands. By the middle of world war, lice weren't just a nuisance, they were a fact of life. Soldiers called them chats. In fact, to chat came to mean delousing, sitting down, stripping off your shirt, and crushing the lice between your fingernails, or burning them with a match. A soldier might be holding a cigarette in one hand and picking lice from his shirt collar with the other. This was not a one-time chore, it was daily, sometimes hourly. It was part of trench life, like cleaning a rifle or writing a letter home. The lice weren't picky, They infested officers and infantry alike. Their eggs, called nits, clung stubbornly to the fibers of shirts and trousers, resistant even to boiling water. The constant itching led to scabs, and the scabs led to infection. Some soldiers scratched so hard they bled, but beyond the discomfort, lice brought something far worse: disease. Trench fever, spread by louse bites, swept through battalions. It caused high fevers, severe headaches, and terrible leg pain that left men bedridden for weeks. It didn't kill, but it made thousands of soldiers too sick to fight. In some divisions, trench fever put more men out of commission than enemy bullets. Efforts to control lice were surprisingly elaborate. Delousing stations were set up near the front lines. Soldiers lined up to steam their uniforms or boil them in great metal vats. Some of these stations were little more than shacks with hot water tanks. Others resembled mobile laundries wheeled in on trucks. Soldiers would strip past their clothing through the steam drums and wait itchy and cold for them to come out. In the meantime, they tried powders and lotions, some made with kerosene or creosote. The smell lingered in the trenches like another kind of weapon. Some tried homemade remedies, dusting sulfur under their arms, or wrapping garlic in cloth and tucking it under their shirts. Nothing worked for long, and still the lice returned. They hid in seams and came back with every reused blanket, every unwashed sock. Every man crowded too close to another. The infestation felt endless. Some soldiers joked that lice were the only creatures who truly won the war. They were never short on food, never out of reach, and never seemed to tire. So what did it do to a man's spirit to never be clean, to scratch in his sleep, to feel something crawling on his skin, even when nothing was there? If lice were the soldiers' most constant companions, then delousing became their most repetitive ritual. Over and over they tried. Boiled the clothes, burned the seams, scrubbed the skin raw, but nothing truly worked, not for long. The problem was more than just the insects. It was the environment. Trenches were damp and crowded, and soldiers often went weeks without a proper change of clothes. Even when they visited a delousing station, they'd put their cleaned shirt back on only to lie down in a flea and lice-ridden bedroll. Infestation was inevitable. Relief, if it came at all, was brief. Mobile delousing units traveled behind the front lines. These were makeshift laundries built into wagons or trucks. Some had steam drums. Others used gasoline-powered heating coils to scald lice to death. Uniforms went in, hopefully cleaner on the way out. But even this system had flaws. Many uniforms shrank or tore under the heat, and some men came back to find their wool jackets reduced to misshapen rags. Soap was precious and rarely strong enough to kill the insects. Shaving body hair helped somewhat, but lice were stubborn, content to live in fabric if skin was unavailable. Some regiments experimented with issuing men a second uniform, allowing them to rotate clothing while one set was cleaned. It was a good idea in theory, but supplies rarely matched the plan. In some parts of the front, chemical powders were distributed. These included naphthalene and creosote, harsh substances that irritated the skin but discouraged lice for a while. Some soldiers applied them so often their skin cracked and peeled, especially in winter. Others gave up on chemicals and relied entirely on manual delousing, pulling lice out one by one psychologically. The presence of lice became part of war's silent torment. The itching wasn't just physical, it invaded the mind. Even when a soldier wasn't scratching, he felt like he should be. Some spoke of the sensation as if their skin never belonged to them again. Veterans reported the phantom crawling for years after they returned home. They'd lie in bed, decades later, and still imagine something wriggling at the nape of their neck. And through it all, lice persisted, not just as a source of discomfort, but as a reminder of how little control soldiers had over their own bodies. The enemy wasn't just out in no man's land. Sometimes it was under your collar, behind your knee, deep in your seams. Even when bullets missed, the lice rarely did. You'd think that washing your clothes wouldn't be a life or death decision, but for many soldiers during the World Wars, finding a place to clean a shirt or pair of socks meant risking everything, sometimes even stepping into the line of fire. Out on the front lines, there were no laundromats, no fresh water taps, and certainly no laundry days. Uniforms soaked up mud, blood, sweat, and were sometimes for weeks on end. The stench of rotting fabric and unwashed bodies became part of the landscape, and yet, now and then, soldiers still tried to clean what they wore. Not for luxury, but for survival. Wet clothes rubbed skin raw. Filth caused infections. A crusted pair of socks could cost you your feet. In many places, the only real option was the river. Slow, winding streams behind the trenches became impromptu wash basins. Soldiers gathered there with their bundles of filthy garments, scrubbing with what little soap they had, or just beating the fabric against rocks. It wasn't very effective, but it was something. Of course, the river was no secret. The enemy knew it too. Snipers sometimes watched the banks, waiting for movement, waiting for someone to stoop down and wash. There are stories, quiet, little stories of men being shot while wringing out a tunic or rinsing their underwear. Laundry, like everything else in the war, could cost a life behind the front. There were mobile wash units, canvas tents with heated barrels, hand-cranked wringers, and tubs of water dark as ink after the first few rinses. These were safer, but overcrowded. Long lines of men waited their turn, knowing their slot might be cut short by an air raid or sudden orders to return to the line. Often, uniforms never fully dried before soldiers had to put them back on, heavy and damp against their skin. In winter, washing became even more dangerous. The icy riverbanks were treacherous, and the water bit through skin. Frozen socks might shatter like glass if bent too sharply, and yet the men still did it somehow, because a clean shirt, even a half-clean one, felt like a return to normal, to home. Sometimes soldiers joked about laundry as if it were a civilian luxury, something absurd in the middle of a battlefield. But those jokes hid the truth. Laundry wasn't about neatness. It was about clinging to a shred of health, comfort, and sanity. And as strange as it sounds, they often had to choose, stay filthy and safe, or wash and take their chances with the bullets. Once behind the front lines, soldiers could sometimes access makeshift sanitation units run by military support services. These weren't pleasant, but they worked most of the time. A tent or small shed may be outfitted with barrels, washboards, and a single fire to heat the water. Water that was used again and again until it turned gray, then brown, then nearly black. The soap, when available, came in small rations, coarse, yellowish bricks that barely lathered and often stung cracked hands. You'd often see 3 or 4 men sharing one wash basin. One soldier would scrub, another would wring, and the others would wait. It wasn't uncommon to mix up uniforms. Names and numbers were scrawled in fading ink on shirt collars, but even those washed away after too many cycles in the bucket. In some theaters of war, like the deserts of North Africa, the challenges were different. Sand blew into everything, every fold of cloth, every corner of your tent. every pocket. Water was so scarce that laundry became a strategic decision. British soldiers developed dry cleaning tricks with sand, rubbing it into fabric to scrape out the worst of the grime. It worked to a degree, but you could never quite get it all out. The sand stayed with you. Medical officers were painfully aware of the link between dirty uniforms and disease. Lice bred in the seams of unwashed trousers, and trench fever spread rapidly where hygiene failed. If you were lucky, you might get a steam treatment blasting your clothes with high heat to kill pests, but more often, soldiers boiled their gear in field pots, stirring their own underwear with mess kit spoons. It wasn't just the infantry either. Nurses, cooks, mechanics, and radio operators had their own struggles. The Red Cross sometimes sent care packages with soap and clean undergarments. These small comforts were treasures passed around, bartered for, or hoarded carefully in letters. Home. Soldiers often asked for socks, not food, not weapons, not tobacco. Socks, because when your boots never come off and your socks are always wet, your feet rot. A fresh pair could mean the difference between another day of marching and a medical discharge. Laundry might have seemed like a minor details, another background task in the chaos of war. But for those living through it, the ability to wash a shirt or scrub your collar wasn't a luxury. It was a survival strategy. And behind every clean uniform in a war photo, there's a hidden story of effort, risk, and often someone else's soap. You're standing in a cramped kitchen in 1942 Berlin, or maybe a farmhouse in rural England, or an apartment in Soviet Leningrad. The walls are thin, the windows are drafty, and the shelves are nearly bare. But on the stove boiling in a battered metal pot is something precious: homemade soap. During the Second World War, commercial soap all but vanished in many parts of the world. Blockades, rationing, and the redirection of fats for explosives meant civilians had to learn how to make their own soap from scratch, using whatever scraps they could find. Animal fat, bacon grease, cooking oil drained from pans. Anything with even a trace of grease was saved, cooled, scraped, and rendered. Lye, the other essential ingredient, was harder to come by. It was traditionally made by dripping water through wood ashes, a slow, inconsistent process. Getting the proportions right was tricky. Too much lye, and the soap would burn your skin. Too little, and it wouldn't clean. Trial and error became the norm. Civilians shared soap recipes in hushed tones. Women's magazines ran careful articles on wartime hygiene alternatives, promoting recipes that substituted soap with starch or salt water where needed. Some people added lavender or rosemary from gardens to mask the harsh smell of animal grease. Others made do with nothing at all. That the result of all this effort was often a small, crumbly bar of soap, grayish, misshapen, oily to the touch, but it lathered just enough, and it was better than nothing. A single bar might be sliced into quarters and distributed among a family of 5. It would be used sparingly, stored carefully, and brought out only when truly needed. In many occupied countries, soap became a black market item. In France, in the Netherlands, in Poland, bars were traded like currency. A good bar of soap could buy you extra bread, or warmth, or silence. Then delivered them to the underground network for mothers with children. Soap wasn't about appearance, it was about health. Dirty hands led to illness, and illness meant risk. A bath, even once a week, became an event. Water was boiled with effort, the soap ration unwrapped like a sacred object, and everyone took turns. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't smell nice, it was boring, hard work. But in the middle of blackouts and bombing raids, the act of making Soap of staying clean became a small form of resistance, a quiet statement: we are still human. Now shift your focus to the battlefield. A trench in Italy, a foxhole in Belgium, or a rain-soaked camp in the South Pacific. In your hands, a dented tin kit, a threadbare towel, and if you're lucky, a government-issued sliver of soap, no bigger than your thumb. For soldiers in World War II, staying clean wasn't a matter of luxury, it was survival. But the conditions were brutal. Mud, sweat, lice, trench foot, and infected wounds made hygiene both essential and almost impossible. A hospital miles from the front line. Each army had its own version of soap. The U.S. military issued small, wax paper-wrapped bars of lye-based soap, often labeled simply soap, toilet, It was harsh and utilitarian, designed more for killing germs than keeping skin soft. British soldiers called theirs government soap, a dry, flaky square that fell apart quickly. The Soviet Red Army used industrial-grade soap when it was available, but often resorted to whatever civilians could spare. Baths, when possible, came in repurposed barrels or makeshift tents called mobile hygiene units. In some units, barbers and medics doubled as hygiene officers, overseeing delousing procedures and inspecting for signs of infection. But soap was precious. It was stolen, traded, hidden, and hoarded. Soldiers mailed extra bars home to family members. Some units ran contests to win an extra ration. Others developed quiet systems of barter: cigarettes for soap, soap for socks. There were makeshift tricks. Powdered soap rations could be mixed with water and stored in empty canteens. Shaving soap doubled as hand soap, foot soap, and even toothpaste in emergencies. Some soldiers carved messages into their bars, dates, initials, or tiny prayers before using them up and watching them disappear one wash at a time. In prisoner of war camps, a single bar of soap could mean the difference between life and death. Hygiene was tightly monitored, and lack of cleanliness often resulted in punishment or disease outbreaks. Soap became a powerful symbol of hope, of dignity, and of control in a place where control was stripped away. And yet, like everything else in war, it never lasted long. Rain would return, dirt would cling, and the little bar of soap would shrink day by day, wash by wash, until it was nothing but a sliver tucked in a tin, waiting for its final use. So, how did such a small, plain object hold such weight both on the battlefield and at home, and in a world torn apart? What made the act of cleaning oneself feel so quietly revolutionary? You're sitting in a barrack made of scrap wood, one sock half off, a metal comb in hand. The soldier beside you is busy burning something over a candle flame. He's holding his shirt, carefully turning the seams toward the flame, watching tiny bodies shrivel with a pop. He looks at you and shrugs. They're back again. In World War II, lice weren't just a nuisance, they were a persistent enemy. For millions of soldiers and civilians, delousing was as regular and necessary as eating. Wherever people lived closely, with limited bathing options and shared sleeping quarters, lice made themselves at home. These weren't just itchy pests. Lice carried disease, most famously typhus, a deadly illness that swept through concentration camps, POW barracks, and even active-duty field hospitals. One louse bite, under the wrong conditions, could kill a man in days. So militaries didn't just tolerate them, they fought them with a level of bureaucracy and determination that rivaled strategies used against the enemy. The U.S. Army issued delousing kits, small tins filled with a white powder known as DDT. Soldiers sprinkled it into their clothing and onto their skin. It wasn't comfortable. It stuck to the body, clogged pores, and had a strange chemical smell that mixed with sweat and fear, but it worked for a while. British troops used paraffin soap, often doubling it with vinegar or boiling water if they could find any. Soviet soldiers, sometimes lacking chemical options, resorted to folk remedies, boiling uniforms in big communal vats, shaving entire heads and bodies, or even freezing garments in the winter cold to kill the bugs. And yet lice always returned. Laundry lines became a symbol of the front, hung between trees, stretched over trenches, even draped over tank barrels. They offered a slim hope for dry, cleaner clothes. Shirts, undergarments, and wool socks fluttered in the wind, often carrying as many lice eggs as threads. Men boiled water in helmets and cooked their socks over open flames. Sometimes they burned their uniforms entirely, just to start over with. Something lice hadn't yet touched in barracks. Soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder, searching each other's collars and cuffs. It was routine. There was no shame. Everyone itched. Everyone scratched. Some wore garlic or onions under their arms, hoping the smell would repel parasites. Others slept wrapped in raincoats or canvas sheets, sweating through the night just to keep the bugs out. Despite all this effort, lice were never far. You could feel them in your seams, in your scalp, in the way someone else looked at you itchy and red-eyed, hoping their turn with the powder or the flame would come soon. So why, despite all the effort, did these tiny creatures win so often? Was it poor supplies, the chaos of movement, or something far more human, our need to feel clean even when the world was dirty? You're holding your shirt with a stick over a field stove. The fabric sizzles, too close to the flames, but you can't afford to let it go. You've seen what lice can do. Not just the scratching and rashes, but the fever, the delirium, the stretcher carried out of the tent, and always someone muttering, typhus. By the midpoint of World War II, lice had become more than an annoyance. They were a logistical crisis. Entire military units had been temporarily withdrawn from front lines just to deal with infestations. Officers issued hygiene mandates almost as often as ammunition checks. Troops were ordered to rotate socks, shave armpits, and report visible bites. In extreme cases, entire uniforms were incinerated. In some units, men were scheduled for communal boil sessions. Giant drums were filled with water, heated over diesel fires, and used to cook the parasites out of clothing. The boiled uniforms were then dried over fences or on racks made from broken wagon parts. Soldiers stood around in blankets or nothing at all, watching their shirts steam in the open air. And when boiling wasn't an option, there was DDT. It was hailed as a miracle, and its side effects became hard to ignore. Sprayed in clouds over bodies, bedding, and barracks, DDT worked well, but it left behind an oily film. Men coughed. Some developed rashes. Others simply hated the way it clung to their skin, like grit that wouldn't wash off. But still, they used it in freezing environments, like the Eastern Front. Some soldiers stuffed their clothes into snowbanks overnight, hoping the cold would kill the lice. They learned to crack open frozen uniforms, like stiff boards, knocking them on the ground to dislodge frozen eggs and carcasses. It wasn't foolproof, but it helped. Inside military hospitals, nurses and medics had their own set of hygiene protocols. Patients were often shaved from head to toe, not out of vanity, but as a lice prevention measure. Linens were boiled, scrubbed, then boiled again. Powdered DDT was dusted under pillows, along mattresses, and even between pages of books. Civilian populations fared worse. In war-torn towns and refugee camps, lice were simply part of life. People combed each other's hair on doorsteps. Mothers used candle flames to search the seams of their children's coats. And in concentration camps, where sanitation was deliberately withheld, lice spread, unchecked, contributing to horrific outbreaks of disease. Despite global efforts, the war never fully won the battle against lice. The parasites adapted, survived, and returned. And so did the itch. But maybe that's the most telling part of all this: the daily routines, the rituals, the near obsession with chasing down something so small. In a war defined by tanks and bombs, why did something so tiny demand so much energy and fear? You've just marched 12 miles, your boots are heavy with mud, and your skin itches from sweat dried hours ago. But before you get food, before rest, before you even drop your packs, someone hands you a spade. It's time to dig the latrine. Throughout both world wars, human waste posed an invisible but deadly threat. Sanitation wasn't just an afterthought, it was a strategic priority. Armies learned early that poor hygiene could take down more men than enemy bullets. In many cases, a shallow trench or a misplaced pit led to outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, or typhoid. Each unit was responsible for its own facilities. In the best-case scenario, soldiers dug slit trenches long, narrow ditches just deep enough to squat over. A canvas or wood plank might serve as a makeshift seat, though most just hovered. Once full, the trench was covered with earth and marked, and then another was dug, again and again. In permanent camps or rear lines, box-style latrines were built, over deeper holes and topped with rudimentary wooden seats. Some even had footrests carved into planks to keep soldiers from slipping into the pita. Surprisingly common hazard during winter or rain. But the farther one got from headquarters, the more primitive things became. Sometimes there were cat holes, shallow individual pits dug with a bayonet or helmet. These were intended for one-time use and then filled in immediately. Soldiers developed a kind of rhythm to it. Dig, squat, bury, move on. It was undignified, exhausting, but necessary. Location mattered immensely. Pits were ideally dug downhill from living areas and far from any water source. Yet under shell fire, or while on the move, these rules were ignored. In some cases, the latrine trench was dug too close to the camp, and when rain came, it overflowed. Waste seeped into tents, kitchens, and even medical quarters. Army manuals gave specific instructions: dig at least 100 yards from food supplies, always downwind, and use lime to cover the waste daily. Lime helped reduce smell and deter flies, persistent carriers of disease. In well-supplied areas, sanitation officers distributed lime like it was gold dust. In remote outposts, soldiers sometimes substituted ash or dry dirt, and yet, despite these efforts, disease found its way in. Flies bred in the uncovered trenches. Men forgot to wash their hands. Latrines were flooded, ignored, or struck by shellfire. In some moments, it felt like the very earth was turning against them, soft, dirty, and full of invisible killers. The war was already dehumanizing, but crouching in a cold trench, pants around your ankles, while shells echoed overhead, what did that do to a person's dignity? As the war moved beyond the fields and forests into prolonged stalemates, trench life demanded new systems especially for managing waste. In sectors where digging was impossibly there due to rocky terrain, rising water tables, or constant shelling, armies adopted what was dryly known as the pail system. You may not have heard of it, but for many soldiers it became a daily ritual. The concept was grimly simple. A large wooden or metal bucket, often lined with tar paper, was placed inside a box with a lid. When filled, it was removed, the contents emptied far from camps, sometimes burned, sometimes buried. Then the process started over. If you were lucky, you didn't get assigned latrine duty. Sanitation squads, often made up of the least senior or the already ill, were responsible for transporting the waste. They were dubbed, sometimes jokingly, the honeymen or bucket brigades, though their work was far from sweet. In winter, the contents froze. In summer, they swarmed with flies. These men became outcasts in their own units, not out of cruelty, but because the stench clung to them like a second uniform. In some trench systems, particularly the well-developed British ones on the Western Front, latrine barrels were placed under wooden seats. The barrels had to be removed under cover of night and hauled behind the lines. The process was dangerous. Many sanitation teams were shelled, sniped at, or ambushed during their runs. One man described it as the most thankless job in France. Improvisation became key. Soldiers sometimes used empty biscuit tins, ammunition boxes, or shell casings when pails weren't available. These temporary fixes were later tossed into shell holes and crudely buried. Regulations frowned on this, but in the heat of war, discipline gave way to convenience. Sanitary order depended not just on tools and guidelines, but on morale. When morale collapsed, hygiene went with it. Some soldiers refused to use latrines altogether, preferring to relieve themselves in corners of the trench. These actions spread illness quickly, especially when trenches flooded or supplies ran low. Army doctors recorded outbreaks of dysentery so severe that entire units were pulled from the line. Officers were instructed to inspect latrines daily, marking compliance with chalk or a logbook, but under heavy bombardment, few risked walking the line for such duties. In neglected sectors, soldiers lived in filth for days, sometimes weeks. In one French trench, rats grew so bold they were seen drinking from the same water cans soldiers used to wash. In the end, it was clear hygiene wasn't a side note to war, it was the front line of survival. But how often do history books dwell on the barrels, buckets, and buried pits that kept armies functioning? The sun beats down, not gently, but with weight, thick, heavy, inescapable. You're in the North African desert, 1942. Flies buzz near your ears, your uniform sticks to your back, and the water you carry isn't for washing, it's for not dying. In the North African campaigns of World War II, from El Alamein to Tobruk, hygiene was almost an afterthought. Soldiers had to fight not just the Axis or the Allies, but the desert itself. The sand was everywhere, between teeth, under fingernails, in the food, and always in the eyes. But water, that was rationed like gold. Bathing, shaving, or even washing hands became rare luxuries. Most troops were allocated less than half a canteen per day for all personal use. You could drink it or use it to rinse your socks. You didn't do both. The conditions were brutally drying. Lips cracked until they bled. Eyelashes crusted with dust. Armpits and boots developed an ecosystem of their own. The smell of unwashed men and dried sweat became part of the uniform. Even medical staff went weeks without proper cleaning. Surgeons operated in tents thick with dust, using instruments rinsed with boiled water when they had it or not at all. And yet, soldiers found a way to cope. Gasoline became an unlikely substitute for soap and water. It stung, dried the skin, and left behind a bitter chemical odor, but it removed grease and killed lice. Troops rubbed gasoline under their arms, over their feet, even on their scalp. Some joked it gave them the desert cologne. Others stopped joking after it left their skin cracked and bleeding. Shaving was still encouraged. Clean-shaven faces reduced lice infestations and helped gas masks fit better. But with water nearly unavailable, razors were often used, drier, with the help of motor oil, cooking fat, or even melted chocolate rations. Soldiers learned to cut quickly and not worry about nicks. Blood dried faster in the desert. For clothing, cleanliness was nearly impossible. Uniforms were beaten against rocks when there was time and water. More often, they were just brushed down with a rag. If anything, socks were rotated not because they were clean, but because the dirtiest pair was already soaked with sweat and needed a day to dry out in the sun. The British 8th Army tried to instill a routine, a dry wash with a rag in the morning, socks turned daily, and faces cleaned at night. But the truth was, most men stopped caring. After a week in the heat, smell and grime simply became part of you. As the wind carried sand across miles of emptiness, hygiene became less about appearance and more about survival. In a land of no water, the body stopped being sacred. You didn't stay clean, you just stayed alive behind the front lines, where artillery booms were only distant thuds. The men of the desert war occasionally found brief moments to chase cleanliness, at least something that resembled it. There were no proper showers in the desert. Instead, soldiers built makeshift bathing stations out of petrol drums cut in half, old steel tubs, and salvaged tent canvas. A common scene behind a supply depot might include a dozen soldiers lining up shirtless in the sun, waiting to splash themselves with barely warm, dust-speckled water poured from dented canisters. The bath was more symbolic than effective one. Pour over the head, one scrub with a bar of sandy soap, and you were done. Soap itself was inconsistent. Military-issue soap often disintegrated in the heat or turned slimy when mixed with the desert's minerals. Some soldiers traded rations for better quality bars from local vendors. Others made their own from rendered fat and ash. It worked, more or less, until it ran out. Improvised hygiene solutions reflected the brutal creativity of wartime living. Helmets were turned into wash basins. Gun oil was sometimes used as deodorant. Camel hair picked up from local markets was braided into crude brushes used to scrape dirt from backs and boots. Even German Poes noted how inventive British and Australian soldiers became in keeping semi-clean, sometimes envying their methods. Uniforms, when time allowed, were boiled in kerosene drums. This not only cleaned them slightly, but killed lice and fleas. The downside was the risk. Kerosene fumes and flames didn't mix well. Burn accidents were common. Still, a boiled shirt, dry and stiff, was better than one soaked in weeks of sweat. Some units set up hygiene tents, where water trucks stopped once a week. Soldiers queued with jerry cans and lined up like they were entering a church. Inside, they might find 2 wooden planks, a single rusty shower head, and 1 bucket of water per man. But the brief spray of water, cold or lukewarm, felt like a blessing. Men emerged, grinning, their skin lighter with dust gone, their spirits briefly lifted, and yet the feeling didn't last. Within an hour, the dry wind returned. Sand collected in sleeves. Sweat beaded again on brows. Cleanliness in the desert was always temporary. It was not a state to reach, but a moment to borrow in the grand scheme of the war. These bathing rituals seem insignificant, but to the men who fought under scorching skies, wiping sand from their teeth and scraping sweat from their eyes, these tiny acts of cleanliness were a kind of resistance, a declaration, even here in the driest, dirtiest corners of war. They could still be human, but how much dignity can you really hold onto when even your soap melts in the sun?